Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Nietzsche podcast. And today we're going to finish our reading of Book 1 of The Gay Science. And there is a bit of a storm going on today, so if you hear any thunder or noise like that in the background, it might bleed through. I'm not exactly sure. So, without further ado, let's get into it. This is section 45, entitled Epicurus. Quote, "Yes, I am proud of the fact that I experience the character of Epicurus quite differently from perhaps everybody else. Whatever I hear or read of him, I enjoy the happiness of the afternoon of antiquity. I see his eyes gaze upon a wide, white sea, across rocks at the shore that are bathed in sunlight, while large and small animals are playing in this light, as secure and calm as the light and his eyes. Such happiness can be invented only by a man who is suffering continually. It is the happiness of eyes that have seen the sea of existence become calm, and now they can never weary of the surface and of the many hues of this tender, shuddering skin of the sea. Never before has voluptuousness been so modest." End quote. So, of course, we've done an entire episode on Nietzsche and his relationship to Epicurus, and I believe we discussed this very aphorism toward the end of that episode. And we also discussed Epicurus in the penultimate episode of last season, perhaps the most important episode of the podcast, in my opinion, or one of the most, probably in the top 5. And that was about the passage entitled Journey to Hades. So if you want to supplement the discussion of Epicurus in this episode, that's where you should look. But in any case, we'll talk about this section, number 45, here, and in the context of what we've read so far in Book 1. So in the book that Nietzsche wrote immediately before The Gay Science, Daybreak, he makes multiple remarks about Epicurus. And he also talks about Epicurus in many letters to Peter Gast, his editor and in some ways Nietzsche's personal assistant. He's the man responsible for committing many of Nietzsche's thoughts to the page when Nietzsche was sick and laid out with migraines and so on. And they discussed Epicurus often because Peter Gast was also fascinated by Epicurus. It was a shared favorite philosopher of the two men. And above all, they both felt a real sense of connection with Epicurus. And they felt that connection very strongly because the general cultural conception and associations with Epicurus and with Epicureanism were so overwhelmingly wrong in the eyes of both Nietzsche and Peter Gast. So this was something that they sort of it was an idiosyncratic view of Epicurus that both men shared. They both feel we're among the only ones who truly understand Epicurus. Now, to put it into modern analytical terms, the truth about Epicurus is that he's a negative hedonist. He advocates for reducing suffering and avoiding life choices that would open you up to the possibility of unnecessary suffering. So some suffering is, of course, necessary, but Epicurus believes the limit on our happiness is suffering. So you can add lots of pleasurable sensations to the experience of a man who is otherwise suffering greatly, and it will not really increase his happiness. Why is that? Well, because his suffering, it dominates your experience of life. It places a limit on the amount of happiness that you can have. So, given that we have a certain amount of suffering that is necessary, we might conclude that suffering is unavoidable, and yet there are a number of things that are within your power that could increase your suffering. And so Epicurus says, avoid political ambition. Avoid any associations or any career paths or situations that might lead you into greater suffering. His ideal life, the good life from the Epicurean perspective, is the little garden with, a company of a handful of good friends who all share in this philosophy. And so it's a small clique of people who enjoy the freely available pleasures of life without vain and ultimately ruinous striving, ambition, aggression, and so on. But this is not how Epicureanism is remembered. Nietzsche writes about this in a letter to Gast. This is August 3rd of 1883. This is included by Walter Kaufmann in a footnote, along with several other letters, but we'll just read this one. Quote, "Epicurus, so far all the world has paid him back, beginning in his own time, for allowing himself to be taken for someone else, and for taking a light divinely light view of opinions about himself. Already during the last period of his fame, while he was still living, the pigs crowded into his gardens, end quote. And Kaufman points out he's referencing Horace there. He doesn't include the quotation itself. He includes the citation, but that it's from the epistles of Horace. But Horace was a Roman poet, and he was an Epicurean. And he wrote in a letter to Tibullus, quote, "As for me, when you want to laugh, you will see me in a fine state, fat and flourishing, a hog from Epicurus's herd," end quote. So, as we all know, I would think, in contemporary English, Epicurean is more or less a synonym for decadent or hedonist, and it's usually in the sense of fine food and fine wine, the good life in the sense of the life of opulent leisure, and usually involves, lots of feasting and drinking. So the lifestyle of a high-class hog, basically. And we see here in Horace that even by the time of the Epicurean zeitgeist in ancient Rome, thousands of years before today, this mistaken connotation of the term Epicurean was already in existence. And Nietzsche basically says in this letter, it's Epicurus' own fault. The world has paid him back for allowing himself to be taken for someone else. And, the funny thing about this is that you can see it as Nietzsche paying Epicurus a kind of compliment here and acknowledging, what does he say, the divinely light view he had of opinions about himself. That's the kind of thing that you can admire from a certain perspective. The kind of person who can genuinely think to himself, oh, he has that opinion about me? Well, it doesn't matter because, that's wrong. Why should I bother myself with the false opinions of others anyway? That's the divine lightheartedness about his reputation in this regard. Again, a admirable quality. But the result of that quality is that his reputation is ruined. And Epicureanism in modern parlance no longer means negative hedonism, but positive hedonism. Pleasure-seeking, in other words. And so, while this may be, we might have to speculate a little bit to get here to this conclusion. Perhaps Nietzsche might have seen that one cannot simply, quote-unquote, be the bigger person, or what have you, and let mass opinion dictate your legacy. Because who you are will be crushed into dust by the mass opinion, the popular interpretations and distortions, and the image of who you are will become just such a distortion. And this is perhaps the impetus for Nietzsche's depiction of Zarathustra's ape, the imitator that Zarathustra encounters, or as Kaufman points out, maybe we can read some of Nietzsche's remarks in Ecce Homo in light of Nietzsche's critique of Epicurus here, such as when he demands, quote, "Above all, do not mistake me for someone else," end quote, and the repeated question at the end of Ecce Homo, quote, "Have I been understood," end quote. And so this is part of why Nietzsche begins this aphorism in section 45 by saying, quote, "I am proud of the fact that I experience the character of Epicurus quite differently from perhaps everybody else," end quote. But there is a connection that I think goes far beyond this fact, that Nietzsche feels that he, and, along with Peter Gast, that he has bypassed the popular prejudices to understand the real Epicurean philosophy. Rather, I think Nietzsche feels he understands Epicurus as a person. And notice he says almost nothing of Epicurus's philosophy here. What he writes about is Epicurus's attempt to find happiness, and he says that he recognizes in the happiness of Epicurus a man who suffered continuously. And we might wonder, well, how could he recognize that? How could he recognize such a thing? Well, Nietzsche's own happiness, it must be said, is also the happiness of a man who suffered continuously. Epicurus must have suffered voluptuously, in other words, exquisitely suffered, in order to invent such a negative hedonist philosophy, to give the reduction of suffering such a centrality in his thought, to make that an ideal. But that voluptuousness is modest, right? Perhaps it has never been expressed so modestly, because Epicurus stops at the surface of the sea of existence, as Nietzsche puts it in his metaphor here. And we might ask, what does this mean? Well, following Democritus, Epicurus' main influence, Epicurus invents no new metaphysical principles and instead understands the world in terms of material principles. And while he tells his followers to be pious and virtuous and appease the gods, it's only for the psychological benefit of doing this, not because it's good in itself to be pious and appease the gods. And so, in short, Epicurus offers a life philosophy that follows from the materialist atomism of Democritus, the first purely natural philosophy, the conclusion or the crescendo of the pre-Socratic project. And the philosophy of Democritus has recourse to as few principles as possible, leaving room for no exceptions, no personifications, no magic or miracles. And so, in Nietzsche's eyes, he's modest because he remains within the surface, the phenomenal world. Epicurus seeks his happiness within that world, that phenomenal world, understood from that material perspective. And even though Nietzsche would have his criticism for all of this, it's just worth noting that the Greek notion of the good life, the idea that life can be good, is so fundamentally opposed to almost every major world religion that comes after the time of Christ and Buddha and all of these other figures that are essentially anti-worldly and basically put forward the idea that you're not going to find happiness in life. No matter what you do, you'll never find it. And that comes part and parcel with the positing of some sort of superordinate moral or metaphysical principle, some sort of transcendent or transcendental reality. And so the modesty of Epicurus is that he does not do that. He doesn't have to bolster his life philosophy by metaphysical principles in order to put forward a notion of the good life, as, for example, Platonism does. And so there's a philosophical agreement between Nietzsche and Epicurus on many things, and this is one of them. Again, he still criticizes Epicurus, and he ultimately comes to the conclusion, he writes elsewhere, that Epicurean delight was out of the question for him. That's what Nietzsche says. An Epicurean delight is out of the question for me. But there's a deeper connection, again, than the level of mere ideas. The two men, Nietzsche surmises, must have a kinship on a personal level in terms of having a shared or similar experience of life, a similar search for happiness within the world of appearance, and a similar experience of great suffering in the quest for that happiness. And that, I think, is why Nietzsche would devote an entire section simply to give an admiring word to Epicurus here, which is really all this aphorism is. All right, let's go on to 46. Quote, "Our amazement. It is a profound and fundamental good fortune that scientific discoveries stand up under examination and furnish the basis again and again for further discoveries. After all, this could be otherwise. Indeed, we are so convinced of the uncertainty and fantasies of our judgments, and of the eternal change of all human laws and concepts, that we are really amazed how well the results of science stand up. Formerly, nothing was known of this fickleness of everything human. The mores of morality sustained the faith that all of man's inner life was attached to iron necessity with eternal clamps. Perhaps people then experienced a similarly voluptuous amazement when they listened to fairy tales. The miraculous gave a great deal of pleasure to those who at times grew tired of the rule and of eternity. To lose firm ground for once, to float, to err, to be mad, that was part of the paradise and the debauchery of bygone ages, while our bliss is like that of a man who has suffered shipwreck, climbed ashore, and now stands with both feet on the firm old earth, amazed that it does not waver." End quote. So I'd like to compare this passage with something Nietzsche writes in an unpublished essay on Truth and Lies in the Non-Moral Sense, which I believe that was 1873. Nietzsche makes a very similar point there, but I think the post-Kantian background of that essay and the most explicitly post-Kantian language that occurs in that essay will help elucidate some things about Nietzsche's position here in the gay science. So this is from On Truth and Lies, quote, "So far as we can penetrate, from the telescopic heights to the microscopic depths, everything is stable, coherent, infinite, regulated, and without any gaps. Science will be able to dig successfully in this shaft forever, and discoveries will harmonize with one another, and not contradict each other. How little does this resemble a product of the imagination? For if it were such, there should be some place where the illusion and reality can be divined. Against this, the following must be said. If each of us had a different kind of sense perception, if we could only perceive things now as a bird, now as a worm, now as a plant, or if one of us saw a stimulus as red, another as blue, while a third even heard the same stimulus as a sound, then no one would speak of such a regularity of nature. Rather, nature would be grasped only as a creation which is subjective in the highest degree. After all, what is a law of nature as such for us? We are not acquainted with it in itself, but only with its effects, which means in its relation to other laws of nature, which in turn are known to us only as sums of relations. Therefore, all these relations always refer again to others and are thoroughly incomprehensible to us in their essence. End quote. Okay, so what is Nietzsche saying here? He's saying, imagine that all of us had no shared experience of sense perception, such that what you experience as the color red, someone else experiences as a sound, or maybe a third person experiences the sensation as a smell. In other words, as Nietzsche says at the end of the passage, we don't really know the laws of nature in their essence. What we know is the sense perception, the way that the law of nature is experienced as a stimulus in the nervous system. And what therefore gives us a sense of a unity, of a coherence to the laws of nature, that gives us the permission or the right to speak of the eternal and enduring quality of laws of nature, as we do in colloquial speech. This comes actually from the perception that, in fact, we do seem to corroborate the sense data of one another, and that we also seem to represent that sense data to ourselves in similar ways. So the point is to give a counterfactual. What if we were to experience all of these sensory inputs differently? Then nature would be experienced as completely chaotic and random, but that is actually not, from what we're able to communicate with one another, that's actually not the case. We don't find incomprehensible magic as the explanation for biological and meteorological processes. We don't find completely random events that are not repeatable and, that we're not able to repeat in any setting. We don't find that that's the norm for nature. As Nietzsche puts it, everything is regular, everything is coherent. But it's actually amazing, in a way Nietzsche is just sort of, to cross-reference this with the passage in The Gay Science, trying to conjure a sense of amazement that our sense data corroborates this regularity and conformity of nature. And, of course, it could have been otherwise. And that if the senses were truly quote-unquote illusory, then we would have at some point been able to see the illusion, Nietzsche says. Perhaps because people with a different sense perception would see different things, and we would communicate this fact. Or the underlying patterns of nature would simply not show regularity, coherence, realness, right? There is a logic, or more properly speaking, a logos, a pattern or structure to the way that things behave. That seems to be what science is discovering. And so when Nietzsche writes here in The Gay Science that it's a profound and fundamental good fortune that scientific discoveries stand up under examination, he writes this because, yet again, quote, it could be otherwise, end quote. So that's part of why I wanted to bring up that passage in On Truth and Lies, because he's making sort of the same point, but he gives us that counterfactual of what if people were to receive fundamentally different sensory inputs, right? So the counterfactual, it could have been otherwise that he gives is more fleshed out and elaborated in that essay. But why the amazement? Why the surprise? Well, because science is a human invention. And the significance of this is that, like with everything human, we don't receive an unfiltered, main line to reality. We get sense impressions and then form a representation of that impression in our nervous system and in our mind. And as Nietzsche says in Human All Too Human, we see by means of our human head and cannot cut it off, and one wonders what would remain over of reality if it was cut off. In other words, human beings show themselves in so many other circumstances to be fallible, to be changeable, to be forgetful, misunderstanding of themselves and their own motives, and willfully deluded and so on, such that science is remarkable. Because human beings, changeable creatures that we are, with fleeting emotions and foggy memories and confused conceptions of our own motives, it's just amazing that animals such as we are able to do science. And Nietzsche's understanding of human history is that for so much of civilization's existence, it's been a kind of iron cramp on the instincts of the human animal, funneling those instincts into certain channels, binding us into these traditional arrangements that are self-perpetuating and hostile to sudden changes, hostile even to the questioning of that traditional arrangement. And these locked people into a kind of psychological regularity, which was fundamentally perhaps illusory. And that is, another perhaps irony here is that Nietzsche, he does recognize the difference between truth and falsehood, between truth and illusion. It's just that he thinks the realm of illusion is the mind, the consciousness, the intellect. That's where we deceive ourselves, and the hard physical, physiological reality is where there can sort of be no mistaking the truth. And that's the realm where science operates, right? But in past ages, pre-scientific ages, people were locked into this illusion of regularity, from the perspective of which they must have been amazed at the stories and the myths in which the laws of nature seemed to bend. Right? That was a source of perhaps bliss for them, hearing a myth or a fairy tale, hearing a story about magic, because everything in human culture was so regular, orderly, and just locked in from generation to generation. Whereas Nietzsche says our bliss, on the other hand, is that of a man who has been shipwrecked and now finds himself standing on firm, solid ground, amazed that this ground does not waver. What is the shipwreck? The old metaphysical and mythological and superstitious worldviews, those products of the consciousness, of the intellect, all of those have shipwrecked. And that leaves us adrift, obviously, but the firm ground that we can swim towards is the earth, firm, solid earth. For Nietzsche, a naturalistic understanding of the world, which reveals that regularity in nature, which, that's what we've always been seeking with these philosophical and religious ideas. It's simply that we have often deceived ourselves because the very nature of the consciousness is in some ways faulty and prone to self-deception and so on and so forth. And so, not a vulgar irrationalist philosophy that Nietzsche is presenting here. That I think this book probably has the most examples of Nietzsche sort of giving these exaltations to science and the human pursuits of scientific truth. Even as somebody who, quite frankly, says, I was the first person to problematize science, right? And this whole book could be seen as Nietzsche trying to perhaps retain and celebrate that scientific spirit while overcoming the inherent faults or limitations of the scientific method, which we could say, yet again, the great advantage of science is that it works empirically. It works within the phenomenal world. That's where the eye of the scientist is directed to, and it operates within the world of the senses. And the great danger of science is that it's created by beings such as we, which are conscious, and therefore might mistake scientific truth for being something other than it is, or might get carried away with the pursuit of scientific truth, failing to recognize the ways in which the undermining of underlying irrational positions that may have furthered life could be affected by a totalizing pursuit of science, right? But that wouldn't be necessarily a problem with like the scientific method per se, but with the application and the way we think about science and applying science to questions of, say, morality or how to find the good life and coming to this sort of mechanistic utilitarian approach to life, again, making it totalizing. And so, yet again, the pattern is that Nietzsche trusts in the senses, he trusts in the physical, and he distrusts the products of the intellect and the mind, the spirit, the Geist. We see that again here, and so it's very interesting to consider Nietzsche, his take on science from that angle. Okay, let's move on to 47, on the suppression of the passions, is the title of this one. Quote, if one continually forbids oneself the expression of the passions, as if that were something to be left to common, coarser, bourgeois, or peasant types, desiring to suppress not the passions themselves, but only their language and gestures, the result is nevertheless precisely what is not desired, the suppression of the passions themselves, or at least their weakening and alteration. The most instructive example is furnished by the court of Louis XIV and all the circles that were dependent on the court. The period that followed, having been educated to suppress their expression, lacked the passions themselves and had in their place graceful, shallow, playful manners. It was an age marked by the incapacity for bad manners. Even an insult was accepted and returned with obliging words. Perhaps our present age furnishes the most remarkable counterpart. Everywhere in life and on the stage, and not least of all in everything that is written, I see the delight in all the coarser eruptions and gestures of passion. What is demanded nowadays is a certain convention of passionateness. Anything but genuine passion. Nevertheless, eventually passion itself will be reached this way, and our descendants will not only indulge in savage and unruly forms, but will be really savage. End quote. So many parallels to our culture today. Once again, I think many people often have this experience with Nietzsche, and it makes you wonder whether what he's discussing actually relates specifically to what's going on today, or whether many of the themes that Nietzsche brings up are sort of eternally recurring, we might say. So this aphorism is fairly straightforward. Again, I just want to mostly look at the structure of Nietzsche's thought here, the pattern that he's followed for many of these sections. So the suppression of one's expression of passion. So to be stoic, unflappable, unmoved. To be like a Vulcan, right? If you ever watched Star Trek or you're a Trek nerd, you know that Vulcans aren't actually emotionless. They just learn a technique of emotional suppression and control and keep their passions. They don't express their emotions, basically. And they're able to even sort of suppress the emotional thoughts and feelings from their minds. And I think implicit in Nietzsche's argument here is something that is just a historical fact. That's a sign of nobility, pretty much cross-culturally. That ability to be unflappable and be in control of yourself. And, there's an example Nietzsche gives elsewhere, I think it's in Beyond Good and Evil, where he sort of brings up the example of, having to stand in court, in a royal court, as part of the assemblage of lords or whatever the case may be, and to stand for hours at a time like a statue as all the tedious affairs of the court are undertaken, without any sign of boredom or outbursts or expressions of emotion. And, what a incredible achievement that is to breed a human animal that can do that. I mean, the other primates can't do that, right? So this is a sign of nobility, but to excessively select for that, for the, overbearing etiquette of never expressing any emotion, being totally stoic and unflappable, eventually this roots out the passions themselves, not just the expression of them, until the ancien regime is declawed. They become a over-socialized, etiquette-obsessed bunch of dandies, right? People who can't even respond to an insult properly. And so they become contemptible in that way, in the way that it's always contemptible when somebody lets themselves be abused. And, it is worth bringing up the writing of, say, Ibn Khaldun here, and just the entire idea of the way in which being socialized in this process of creating a nobility, which is a social animal, has this weakening effect. And it's a nobility like this, deprived of passion, that eventually becomes unable to defend its sacred claim to rulership. So the attempt to suppress the outward appearance arrives at a place where the passion itself is suppressed. If you don't use it, you lose it, right? You atrophy the passionate impulses within your soul. But we're in the opposite case in modern times. The coarsest expressions of passion are permitted and even demanded. And yet, when there is a, quote, certain convention of passionateness, end quote, Nietzsche says also this is, quote, anything but genuine passion, end quote. And so, in the end, the only way back to this genuine passion is becoming savage again. And perhaps, Nietzsche sort of wonders here, maybe this appearance of passionateness, in the same way as with the ancien regime, maybe the appearance will actually lead to a change in the underlying character. And, I don't know. It's worth saying that I think this aphorism is a great example of the unsystematic nature of Nietzsche's thought. Not that this thought doesn't work with the other ideas that he puts forward in his broader philosophy. It's just an idea that's never really developed elsewhere, and it almost strikes us as a kind of just random thought that he might have had, right? But again, we can sort of tie this in with the writings of people like Ibn Khaldun and so on, the notion that when the impulses are corrupted by luxuria, when the impulses are weakened by the demands of socialization and conformity to the mores, and when they're uprooted by religious teaching, and when we redirect all our energy into the institutions of art and learning, the person that is produced by that process, in spite of all the benefits that it may give us, that kind of person that is bred by that process is the kind of person who lives in reaction against his own impulses. That is the quote-unquote normal way of being for him. And to give free rein to the impulses in this state is more or less impossible. It's dangerous for that kind of person. The only way to return to an active existence in which one lives in accord with the instincts would be when that process of socialization, of civilization, violently comes to a halt. And so I bring this up because that seems to be more in keeping with the kinds of conclusions that Nietzsche would eventually reach, that it's not so much a change in the social mores or the culture that affects a change in the underlying essence or character of the people. It is the actual conditions of their living. And he expands on this in great detail in Beyond Good and Evil. And so in light of that, on a deeper level, we might say all socialization proceeds by managing expressions of passion. And from the religious perspective, the moralist perspective within those societies, there's usually the actual aim of habituating the members of society towards actually being passionless. The whole structure of what happens in this aphorism, where the management of the expression gives rise to actually rooting out the passion itself, that might actually be the aim of world religions. But even if one attempts to socialize people for the sake of making them more passionate, as Nietzsche suggests our coarser age is doing, it doesn't seem to work from that direction. I think that's the later conclusion he would come to, that we could habituate people into being more passionate. Because however you attempt to manage the expressions of impulses, however you attempt to shape and mold the human animal, it is actually that very act of shaping and molding, the act of socializing, that makes them passionless, or relatively passionless. That is to say, that being made civilized, we necessarily have to live in reaction to our impulses, because civilization itself is premised on that idea. It always demands that we not fulfill every impulse that we have. And so the only way to return to that communion with impulse, living in communion with our impulses, I would say, and I think this is based on Nietzsche's later ideas, is in the cracks, the breaks between the existence of the state, between different civilizations in that interregnum. But Nietzsche, again, this is a very experimental, non-systematic book, and so he's just sort of putting forward the thought here of perhaps it will work in the other direction. I personally would say that I think he would conclude ultimately that it does not, but it's an interesting thought nonetheless. So with that, let's move on to section 28, which is called The Knowledge of Misery. And this is a bit of a longer section. We're going to break it up into pieces here. So we'll start with the first part of it. Quote, "Perhaps there is nothing that separates men or ages more profoundly than a difference in their knowledge of misery of the soul as well as the body. Regarding the latter, we moderns may well be, all of us, in spite of our frailties and infirmities, tyros who rely on fantasies, for lack of any ample first-hand experience compared to the age of fear, the longest of all ages, in which individuals had to protect themselves. In those days, one received ample training in bodily torments and deprivations, and one understood even a certain cruelty against oneself and a voluntary habituation to pain as a necessary means of self-preservation. In those days, one educated those close to one to endure pain. In those days, one enjoyed inflicting pain and saw the worst things of this kind happen to others without feeling anything but one's own safety. But regarding misery of the soul, I now look at every person to see whether he knows this from experience or from descriptions, whether he still considers it necessary to simulate this knowledge, say, as a sign of refinement, or whether at the bottom of his soul he no longer believes in great pains of the soul, and has much the same experience when they are mentioned, that he has at the mention of great physical sufferings, which make him think of his own toothaches and stomach aches, but that is how matters seem to me to stand with most people today." End quote. So there's a great Nietzschean coinage elsewhere. I think it's in the Genealogy, but I might be wrong. But it's where he's discussing the immense amount of pain required to socialize human beings and how much torture and public execution and so on and so forth in order to make civilized animals. And Nietzsche sort of says, this is a bit of a tongue-in-cheek remark, he says, well, don't worry, it's likely that pain didn't hurt as much back then. And we might think of Patrick Swayze from Roadhouse, one of the best lines in all of cinematic history, "Pain don't hurt." So Nietzsche makes a distinction here in this paragraph between pain of the body and pain of the soul. But, he says, we moderns have very little of either one. When it comes to bodily pain, we're no longer accustomed to that state of affairs in prehistoric times, when everyone is subject to great pains, either just because of the hardship of nature and the struggle for survival, or by those very cruel punishments that were needed to civilize people. Men actually enjoyed dispensing pain at this time, which we think of as a monstrous quality in modern times, but it might have been necessary to have that quality. You might have looked at the sadistic person who was a member of your tribe as perhaps one of the most valuable members of the tribe. And furthermore, the conscientious person made sure that those around them, whom they cared about, knew pain and experienced pain. We might think of the gauntlet that you have to run. That's required of young men in some Native American tribes, or just the rites of passage into manhood that often involve pain or some kind of challenge or test of endurance, and these occur all over the world. Compared to the level of pain that went on in this time period of prehistory, which dwarfs any time that man has spent in civilization, compared to that, we moderns experience relatively little physical pain. We barely are familiar with pain at all. And when it comes to misery of the soul, the situation is similar. The case for most human beings is that they no longer know those great pains of the soul. And at best, their inner pains, their knowledge of the misery of the soul, is similar in scale to the kind of intensity of the bodily pain they're familiar with, which is to say, not much. The occasional toothache or stomachache, right? People put on airs of experiencing a great pain of the soul because it's become a sign of refinement, which is very interesting. But it's not the norm to actually be familiar with these great pains of the soul. Again, there can be exceptions to all of these claims, but we're talking about the norm for the modern age. So let's finish out the text. Quote, "The general lack of experience of pain of both kinds, and the relative rarity of the sight of anyone who is suffering have an important consequence. Pain is now hated much more than was the case formerly. One speaks much worse of it. Indeed, one considers the existence of the mere thought of pain scarcely endurable, and turns it into a reproach against the whole of existence. The emergence of pessimistic philosophies is by no means a sign of great and terrible misery. No, these question marks about the value of all life are put up in ages in which the refinement and alleviation of existence makes even the inevitable mosquito bites of the soul and the body seem much too bloody and malignant, and one is so poor in real experiences of pain that one would like to consider painful general ideas as suffering of the first order. There is a recipe against pessimistic philosophers and the excessive sensitivity that seems to me the real misery of the present age, but this recipe may sound too cruel and might itself be counted among the signs that lead people to judge that, quote, existence is something evil. Well, the recipe against this misery is misery, end quote. So, a couple things. By hiding pain, by making the executions and tortures no longer public, by actually increasing the safety of society so that less violence and less suffering occurs in general, and by use of modern medicine and drugs to numb the pain, to make the sufferer of physical pain lose consciousness of that pain. The modern world has basically made the sight of pain, the sight of pain itself has become way more painful than it ever was before. But to the person living in an early agricultural city-state, or especially if they were a hunter-gatherer, the sight of suffering of one's own kin and the suffering of animals, the suffering of those outside the tribe, the suffering of the punished criminal, even the routine experience of your own suffering, this is all normal. And so the sight of it was not experienced painfully. The reality or the consciousness, the awareness of suffering did not itself heighten the base level of suffering that was already occurring. It didn't radiate and spread, right? So this is a very important idea in Nietzsche, the way that suffering, or we might use the language he uses here, misery, radiates through society via the route of consciousness. And that ties in with his critique of pity. In fact, you could say it is his critique of pity, is that pity is a vector for expanding and radiating suffering. But so remember, at the beginning of the passage, Nietzsche establishes two types of suffering. We have a deficit of physical suffering, and the result is what? Well, that now when physical suffering occurs, it is far more painful to our consciousness. That's the result. So we might also remember Nietzsche's earlier ruminations on the possibility that by reducing suffering, we might also reduce pleasure by that same token. And conversely, that increasing pleasure might necessitate an increase in suffering. Here, we have a different consideration, but it's also a critique of the doctrines aimed at ending suffering. That you might make the experience of suffering less usual, let's say 1,000 times less normal than before. But when unusual instances of suffering occur, they'll be 1,000 times worse for everyone involved. But there's a second type of misery to consider, right? The misery of the soul. And following the same structure, if the misery of the soul is made highly unusual, then any amount of misery of the soul will be experienced as much, much worse. And what is the result of this? Pessimistic philosophy. Pessimism is not a product of suffering, but of its absence. This expression of this great misery of the soul in philosophical form is itself the outcry of a soul that has been shielded from misery. And again, this is something that we could maybe question or challenge on a logical or metaphysical level, and yet it does seem to be the case psychologically. People who have lives full of hardship, or who live in a more, shall we say, natural setting, that are subjected to more daily hardships and pressures, tend to be more psychologically well-adjusted than people who are shielded from all of these things. And I should clarify, I'm not saying, there's obviously traumatic experiences that can make you much worse adjusted or much more badly adjusted psychologically. I'm not saying that's impossible. But again, just speaking as a sort of general rule, again, we always have to bring this to mind because it's one of the major flaws of our society, and it's one that people don't take seriously enough, that in the richest, most privileged, safest, most comfortable societies that have ever been created, people are at their unhappiest. And, that correlates with high rates of anxiety, depression, all these mood disorders, and so on and so forth. And so Nietzsche puts all of this into physiological language, really. If you think about it, he's saying it's a matter of sensitivity. So what happens with exposure? Hardness, tolerance, the ability to endure. That's what the point of exposure therapy is. What happens when there is a lack of exposure? Oversensitivity, fragility, weakness. And so the proof of the case is America today, and America has been made overly sensitive. What would the cure be? Exposure. The cure for misery is misery. Amazing coinage, once again, from our boy Nietzsche. So let's move on to section 49. This is entitled Magnanimity and Related Matters. Quote, "Those paradoxical phenomena, like the sudden chill in the behavior of an emotional person, or the humor of a melancholic, and above all, magnanimity as a sudden renunciation of revenge, or of the satisfaction of envy, appear in people who harbor a powerful centrifugal force and experience sudden satiety and sudden nausea. Their satisfactions are so quick and strong that they are followed instantly by weariness and aversion, and a flight into the opposite taste. In this opposite, the cramp of feeling is resolved, in one person by a sudden chill, in another by laughter, in a third person by tears of self-sacrifice. The magnanimous person, or at least the type of magnanimity that has always been considered most impressive, appears to me as an extremely vengeful person who beholds satisfaction so close at hand, and who drains it so fully and thoroughly to the last drop in anticipation that a tremendous and quick nausea follows this quick orgy, and now he rises, quote, above himself, as they say, and forgives his enemy, and even blesses and honors him. With this violence against himself, with this scorn for his lust for revenge that a moment ago was still so powerful, he merely yields to a new impulse that has now attained power over him: nausea. And he does this just as impatiently and orgiastically as he anticipated a moment earlier the delight in revenge, draining it in his imagination. Magnanimity contains the same degree of egoism as does revenge, but egoism of a different quality." End quote. So, I must say, I'm a bit skeptical of the account that Nietzsche gives, the psychological account. But it's once again important to see the underlying logic of a passage like this one. So the subject of the passage is the sudden reversal of an impulse, the sudden renunciation of an impulse, a paradoxical act when we consider the person's established character. What Nietzsche is trying to do here in describing human behavior is to do so psychologically, yes, but with an understanding rooted in physiology, once again using physiological language. And Nietzsche's understanding of such phenomena is that it's this behavior that we're discussing, this sudden renunciation, is something determined by 1,000 or 1,000,000 gradual changes, gradual processes that go on in the background and that we mostly don't even notice. And so there is a real concern in the background of Nietzsche's thought about countering the notion of sudden character change. The sudden character change that comes about seemingly spontaneously. Nietzsche wishes to counter this narrative. And why? Well, because that is the stuff of religious experience. It's the very fact that we find it unfathomable without some sort of intercession of the divine, usually. The total transformation of one's character, either due to the grace of God, or, you don't have to include God, but, if you say that they did so out of an act of will, then you're definitely capitulating to the free will doctrine. And either way, one's appealing to a kind of magical principle in that case, because in both cases it's an uncaused cause, whether it's the will of God or the will of the individual. Both explanations would fly in the face of the gradualist, grounded, biological picture of the human being. And Nietzsche thinks, therefore, that this way of thinking, this belief in the spontaneous character change, is a kind of error, and it might even be a malicious error. It's another attempt to philosophically sever the consciousness off from the body and treat it as an autonomously, arbitrarily ruling thing, some sort of core to the human being. The problem, of course, for Nietzsche's position is that there seem to be examples of such sudden transformations throughout history and throughout our religious stories and myths of the sinner becoming a saint, or the person who is on the verge of taking revenge and decides to renounce the taking of revenge, even to honor his enemy. And Nietzsche describes this as doing violence to oneself, and yet there seem to be examples of it. And, I would say that this theme actually appears in so many fictitious stories that there's too many to count, where that's the moral of so many stories about revenge, where the character has been horrifically wronged in some way, but what they have to learn is that taking revenge is wrong. And, perhaps the character has the chance to enact the revenge, and at the last moment says, "No, I won't kill you," And we could see the reason why the moralist would argue, based on examples such as this, wherever we happen to find them in real life, stories of criminals becoming reformed, vindictive people showing mercy, and so on. People who will go, family members who will go and testify, before sentencing, they'll testify against a convicted murderer and say, "I forgive him as a Christian for murdering my daughter in cold blood," right? Things like that really happen. And many people will take this as evidence for moral realism, that man can make autonomous moral choices, even though it makes no sense from the perspective that man is simply an animal, a natural being driven by impulse, that we must have some power to arbitrarily halt said impulses and follow a moral duty, for example, not to take revenge. And so the picture that Nietzsche gives us here is a counter to that idea. That's what I'm trying to establish here. That is the point of what Nietzsche's doing. He's saying, no, we do have an explanation. These are not unegoistic acts. These are not selfless acts, the act of renouncing revenge. That simply comes from a competing impulse within the self. So that, in other words, One wishes to take revenge out of one drive, and a competing drive, which Nietzsche here names as nausea, pushes against taking that action. One feels sick at the thought of, say, becoming a murderer or something like that. Or the thought of, what would your loved one, whom you're avenging, think of you taking this bloody revenge? These conscious thoughts are themselves just the post hoc rationalizations of nausea in that way. The nausea is what is active here. We might later give it a moral explanation. We might make the drive into a reason why we acted that way, why we chose to act that way. But what actually creates the nausea is that one drained their energy in their anticipation of the act. Because, revenge is something we could definitely understand as a phenomenon that might consume a person and make them fixate on the idea of revenge all the time. And so Nietzsche's psychophysiological explanation is basically that they spent all their mental energy building up to the act, and then when the time comes, the nausea is the expression of the draining of that energy, the inability to follow through. And I see a lot of problems with this explanation, or it just isn't convincing to me. I would lay out a different picture of why someone would abandon the pursuit of revenge. It would probably have more to do with social conditioning and incentives and the whole process of socialization and the fact that we've internalized that we should defer all violence to the third party, monopoly on violence, which we call the state, right? These are things I think Nietzsche would largely agree with, by the way. It's just not the explanation he gives here. But what's important yet again is the fact that Nietzsche attempts to explain the sudden character change in terms of what? Well, impulses, energy, satiety, lust, physical feelings and sensations, and a power struggle between drives. Not by the autonomously acting will, not by divine intercession. That does a miraculous transformation of one's character. That is the key thing. And I should add, as just a final note, something else that comes to mind. And it was because I used the example of someone, on the stand testifying against the murderer of their child, forgiving them. I do recall hearing I don't know if it was a radio lab, something I heard on the radio a while ago, of someone, it was some piece on forgiveness and someone describing what happened when they forgived the murderer of their child and how he was like reading his prepared statement. And when he looked up at the man's face, the convicted criminal, the murderer, he said the man's face just looked like a sufferer in hell. That the feeling of being forgiven by the parent of the person that you killed was probably quite horrible for this person. And remember what Jesus says when he says that you should forgive your enemy, or all the world says to hate your enemy, but I tell you to love your enemy because this will pour hot coals down on their head. And you hear people express this sentiment all the time. I forgive my enemies because nothing pisses them off more. And so that would actually be, I think, perhaps the most powerful explanation, that it doesn't really necessarily work with maybe the broader point Nietzsche's trying to make about the character change or the transformation, the renunciation of some drive or impulse, but specifically with the idea of choosing forgiveness over revenge. The fact is, it's right there in the holy book that promotes this as a sort of higher road to take. The reason why you should take this higher road is because it'll piss off your enemies or make them feel worse than they would ever feel than if you just went up and ranted and raved about how they were a horrible monster. Forgiving them will make them suffer so much more greatly, right? And that is, I'm sure any Christians listening will say, well, anyone who forgives for that reason, for that motivation, is, not actually acting as a true Christian. Of course, what Nietzsche would say is that the ostensible reasons, the reasons that you tell yourself for why you forgive, are simply a mask for that underlying reason, which I think when it comes to revenge, with Nietzsche's later analysis and genealogy of morality, he would come to see the entire Christian religion as sort of this subterranean cult of revenge. So, I think that's all worth considering as well in relation to this aphorism. So with that, let's move on to number 50. The argument of growing solitude. Quote, The reproaches of conscience are weak even in the most conscientious people compared to the feeling this or that is against the morals of your society. A cold look or a sneer on the face of those among whom and for whom one has been educated is feared even by the strongest. What is it that they are really afraid of? Growing solitude. This is the argument that rebuts even the best arguments for a person or cause. Thus, the herd instinct speaks up in us. End quote. So this one, I think, is pretty straightforward. Regardless of what we might really think, the feeling of growing solitude is itself a refutation of all that stands opposed to the herd instinct. And remember that this herd instinct is part and parcel with morality, with the voice of conscience, or rather the bite of conscience. And, this is a tacit acknowledgement of something that Nietzsche is often accused of ignoring, although, as we'll continue to see as we go through the text, it's a misreading of Nietzsche. Nietzsche fully acknowledges here we're social animals, and that this is, in some sense, one of our greatest strengths and one of our greatest weaknesses, but for better or for worse, it is what we are. You can see it as like a tragic aspect of the human animal, one of those things that makes us human all too human. You can also see it as one of our again, great advantages in survival, but it's simply the truth. And the fact is, when it comes to problem solving or utilitarian calculus, the collective brain power of the herd is simply unmatched. But when it comes to questions of value judgments, the individual discernment of the intellect in Nietzsche's view will always be superior to the judgments of the collective. And why would that be? Well, because the collective value judgments, like all value judgments, are not designed to determine truth, but for the preservation of that very social arrangement, for the benefit of the collective, which makes the individual into an instrument. So multiple minds are greater in things like scientific research, right? Where they can each act as their own individual neuron as part of this self-corrective mechanism in the pursuit of truth. But again, it's a different story when we're talking about value judgments, because one's individual discernment is often capable of rather easily penetrating through the errors of the popular prejudices. It's really not that difficult. What keeps the individual intellects from departing from those popular prejudices is not their rational defensibility. It's their attraction. Because those popular prejudices, so long as you believe in them, that keeps you as a part of the collective, and therefore not a solitary individual. And so, in other words, the tacit threat against he who establishes himself in opposition to the collective will is that he'll experience the worst thing that a social animal can experience: exile, ostracism. And so that's why Nietzsche says, he writes elsewhere, the free spirit must take solitude and make it into one of their virtues. You have to acquire a taste for it, whereas all the rest of the world finds it bitter. Because if you don't acquire a taste for solitude, the aversion to it will keep you from really thinking. And most of what passes for thinking isn't really thinking. It's just rationalizing one's way back into conformity with those around them, or with rationalizing one's way back into the good graces of the cause or the people with whom you identify. We don't permit ourselves the thoughts that challenge that state of affairs, because that would lead us to being alone. And so we don't think. Just, again, speaking in general terms about the rule, not necessarily about the exception. So let's move on. This is 51, truthfulness. Quote, I favor any skepsis to which I may reply, let us try it. But I no longer wish to hear anything of all those things and questions that do not permit any experiment. That is the limit of my truthfulness, for there courage has lost its right. End quote. Another short, straightforward one. Courage loses its right at the limit of testability. It's actually that's a very profound, compact little sentiment there. We can only speak of courage and bravery, and conversely of cowardice, up to the point where we can actually try what is being advocated. If one appears brave, but in advocacy for something we can't try, or that is never going to happen, well, then it's not real bravery. We're not permitted to speak of bravery at that point. So testability is the point at which talk becomes action. And Nietzsche is saying, that's the limit of my truthfulness. There's been much ado about this throughout the history of Nietzsche scholarship, I would say. and we've certainly discussed it on the channel, the Nietzschean position on truth. And while it's complicated by many factors, such as, Nietzsche's suggestion that human beings have a need for falsehoods, for example. If you ask me as a yes or no question whether Nietzsche believes that truth is valuable or desirable, to Nietzsche, the answer would be yes. Nietzsche is here asserting an allegiance to the value of truth when it comes to a brave skepticism that says, let us try it. But the important complication is that he's willing to put a limit on that. Put a limit on his pursuit of truth, really. And most of us would say that with a given value or given virtue, that we shouldn't put limits on virtues, right? There's nothing excessive when it comes to good qualities, so there's no need for moderation. Maybe that's giving the popular prejudices not enough credit. Maybe there are more Aristotelians around who understand the golden mean than I'm sort of giving the public consciousness credit for. But most people would say we should pursue the truth no matter what, and so on. We, as Nietzsche says, we always make a brave noise whenever the question of the truth is touched. But the simple yet profound insight here is that when we pursue the truth beyond what is empirically given, or beyond what is in our senses or in our experience, or beyond what we can test and experiment with, when we pursue, for example, the truth of purely abstract propositions, that pursuit of truth becomes vicious rather than virtuous. And why is that? Well, because it can't be tempered with any other virtues. Just for one thing, it's a purely intellectual exercise. It's untethered from the world. So testing, empiricism, etc., keeps us grounded. Again, relatively straightforward. It's almost doesn't need to be unpacked the way I have done it. But, in the same way, to use a vulgar example, that the same way that somebody can talk trash behind a keyboard, but if they had to test their words in physical combat, it's a different story, right? Talking trash with no test to back it up requires no bravery, so you're not brave for doing it. So the summary is, talk is cheap. If you want to know, you have to try it. And if you're talking about things you can never try, then in some sense, it's neither brave nor cowardly. It's just navel-gazing, right? So let's move on. We'll go to 52. What others know about us. Quote, "What we know about ourselves and remember is not so decisive for the happiness of our life as people suppose. One day, that which others know about us, or think they know, assaults us, and then we realize that this is more powerful. It is easier to cope with a bad conscience than to cope with a bad reputation." End quote. So another aphorism sort of meditating on morality as herd instinct, conscience as herd instinct, but with a very important complication. Again, I don't think this one requires that much exegesis, but I think we can help understand it by reference to Nietzsche's earlier remarks in Epicurus that we started out the episode with, or to the passage a couple of sections earlier about the power of growing solitude, as it threatens to cut us off from the collective, the farther we stray from the judgments and the beliefs of the collective. So Nietzsche suggests something here, which is really contrary to our cheap cliche that being true to yourself is the most important thing, or, gaining the world's not worth it if you lose your soul, and so on and so forth. We've been enculturated to believe that really, at the end of the day, one's own good or bad conscience is what matters. But what we find in practice is that even though, as Nietzsche argues elsewhere, conscience itself is a product of the herd, morality is the herd instinct in the individual, and so on and so forth, those beliefs that one internalizes have to sort of develop over long ages, right? Develop very gradually. And what is more powerful than the enculturated beliefs and judgments that you've internalized are the beliefs and judgments that the collective currently expresses, that is currently bearing down upon you. So, in other words, to make all this concrete, let's say you're involved in a political party and you do something like you leak information to a journalist that betrays that party, but you do it because you believe it's the right thing to do. Let's say the politician whose office you work for is corrupt, and you say, it doesn't matter that I agree with his agenda, he's corrupt, and I'm going to leak this information to a journalist. And because of the negative, and it comes out that you did this, right? And because of the negative consequences of your actions, the party at large judges you to be a bad person or a a plant for the other party or what have you, right? They say all sorts of nasty things. And even though on the inside you feel you did the right thing, the voices of countless members of your own tribe telling you that you're bad, in the here and now, that overrides that feeling. In other words, our conscience, which is shaped by the collective over countless generations, is somewhat malleable according to the predominant judgments of the collective right now. It feels worse to be hated than it does to have a good reputation but a bad conscience, right? And perhaps that's part of the explanation for the evil man who's nonetheless happy. His bad conscience, this is one possible explanation, I'm not saying it's the whole thing, but his bad conscience is easily subdued, if you're loved and respected and popular in the here and now. And I think this is what explains how so many politicians, again to stay with the political metaphors, could betray their own principles and seemingly live with it very easily, because the love and the adulation that they get out of, because of their own popularity, sort of counter signals to them against the dictates of their inner conscience that no, you are in the right, you are a good person, you're loved by so many, and so on and so forth. So another very clear section, or another very straightforward section, but the structure of Nietzsche's thought, the implications are once again interesting. The power over the collective, over the individual, psychologically, has been established, but the power of the collective now also supersedes the power of past generations of collectives that have worked upon the psyche. So that's very important as well to consider. Number 53, quote, where the good begins. Where the poor power of the eye can no longer see the evil impulse as such, but because it has become too subtle, man posits the realm of goodness, and the feeling that we have now entered the realm of goodness excites all those impulses which had been threatened and limited by the evil impulses, like the feeling of security, of comfort, of benevolence. Hence, the duller the eye, the more extensive the good. Hence, the eternal cheerfulness of the common people and of children. Hence, the gloominess and grief, akin to a bad conscience, of the great thinkers. End quote. So good begins where we can no longer see evil. But why? Because the evil has become more subtle. And that is a very key point that I feel Nietzsche has already established throughout this book, that those impulses and actions and behaviors and character types which we would call good are in fact just a more refined form of evil. So that's worth keeping in mind. But we can also see this passage as a prefiguration of the insights in genealogy, that the slave morality, the reactive morality, begins from the position of what harms me, what hurts me, what causes me and my group suffering or fear. It begins from the primary judgment of saying no to those things, no to what is harmful, outside, external, threatening, etc. And then as a secondary consideration, it comes to the determination of what is good. That is to say, what is harmless, what is not threatening, what does not cause me to experience pain or fear. And so that, the good, is a secondary consideration in the slave morality, and it's a negative definition. So this is the normal way that we assess what is evil and what is good, according to the modern morality, which is inherited from the Christian morality, which originates in that kind of moral calculus, that of the reactive moralist. So Nietzsche here describes this psychological landscape of goodness, quote-unquote, discovered in the absence of evil. And he explicitly says he's discussing the common type of moral valuations, and this sort of compares it with the naivete of children. So the duller the eye, the more extensive the good. Why? Because from this inverted negative definition of goodness, we don't actually have to look for the good. We don't find the positive content of the good. We only have to not detect evil. So goodness is found not when we start to sense something, but when we don't sense something, in this case, evil. And when we don't find a trace of evil, we say we have found the good. And what does this mean? It means that the dull eye sees the most good because it's the eye least capable of seeing evil. In other words, the least discerning people are the most naive and the most moralistic. The least discerning people are the ones most apt to see the good in the world, in society, in other people, maybe even in themselves. And this is why Nietzsche refers to his project, especially in his later years, as that of the immoralist, and brings up the inherent evil in philosophy. And, the inherent evil from the moralist perspective in real skepsis, real truth-seeking. Because that discernment, that very faculty of discernment itself can be called evil, because it uncovers that much of what the less discerning eye considers good is in fact, again, just a refined form of evil. And that's what Nietzsche has done throughout this book, and that's the bad conscience of great thinkers. They are more suspicious and thus more wicked because of their devotion to science, their devotion to empiricism, and I mean that in a very real and practical sense. And therefore, such a person can come to a conclusion such as that selfless moral values are rooted in the selfishness of the collective, of the average type of person, their selfishness and their recognition of their mutual interest and stamping down the extraordinary people. And so in that judgment, which is in an earlier aphorism that we considered, what is Nietzsche doing? He is pointing to the quote-unquote evil that less discerning eyes have not seen. And therefore, what do masses of people to this very day tend to call Nietzsche? They call him evil. They call him all sorts of names. But in truth, it's just that they're disturbed that where they once saw a realm of pure goodness, now they see much that is selfish and dangerous and harmful. And disrupting that naivete makes us less innocent and therefore, taking away people's innocence. I mean, that's the original story of how the fall of man from the Genesis story, right? It's a loss of innocence. And there was an aphorism in this book that we discussed in an earlier reading that concerned this as well. Making people lose their innocence is considered an evil thing because it makes them more culpable and evil as well. And so that's the reason for this entire herdish opposition to the individual discernment. So moving on, the next aphorism, number 54, Nietzsche sort of stops here and takes stock of where we are in this aphorism. And we should recall the statements in the preface once again that we considered, the sections of the preface that we looked at, namely the bit about the return to appearance, right? Those Greeks knew how to live. They were superficial out of profundity, that very important line. So the rejection of the underlying, the search for an ontological truth, and the return to the phenomenal world, and the understanding of our existence starting from that position. So here is section 54, which is entitled, The Consciousness of Appearance. Quote, "How wonderful and new, and yet how gruesome and ironic I find my position vis-a-vis the whole of existence in the light of my insight. I have discovered for myself that the human and animal past, indeed the whole primal age and past of all sentient being, continues in me to invent, to love, to hate, and to infer. I suddenly woke up in the midst of this dream, but only to the consciousness that I am dreaming, and that I must go on dreaming lest I perish, as a somnambulist must go on dreaming lest he fall. What is appearance for me now? Certainly not the opposite of some essence. What could I say about any essence except to name the attributes of its appearance? Certainly not a dead mask that one could place on an unknown X or remove from it. Appearance is for me that which lives and is effective, and goes so far in its self-mockery that it makes me feel that this is appearance and will-o'-the-wisp and a dance of spirits and nothing more. That among all these dreamers, I too, who know, am dancing my dance, that the knower is a means for prolonging the earthly dance, and thus belongs to the masters of ceremony, of existence, and that the subtle consistency and interrelatedness of all knowledge is perhaps, and will be, the highest means to preserve the universality of dreaming and the mutual comprehension of all dreamers, and thus also the continuation of the dream." End quote. So the first line I want to focus on here, I suddenly awoke in the midst of a dream and realized that I had to go on dreaming lest I perish. It's obviously a metaphor, but I don't know if any of you have had the experience of lucid dreaming, but I do semi-regularly. it's usually not long-lasting. Usually what happens is that I realize I'm dreaming, and then I'm suddenly enticed by the possibilities of lucid dreaming. And consequently, I really don't want to wake up. I'm like, oh, I should take advantage of this. I could do anything because I'm lucidly dreaming, right? And then very quickly, by throwing myself into the dream wholeheartedly, I forget that I'm dreaming. So it's a very fleeting awareness for me. That doesn't lead to me waking up, usually. It's just that the consciousness that I'm dreaming vanishes as quickly as I attained it. But so there are several interpretations we could give of what Nietzsche's saying here. And there's the fact that he brings up our whole human and animal past that continues to invent, to love, to hate, to infer. Kaufman seems to interpret this passage as Nietzsche coming to terms with the limits and the faults and the irrational nature of human consciousness, and the fact that, as we said before, we see by means of our human head and cannot cut it off. That the way that we interpret, the way that we come to our beliefs, the way that we experience and construct our representations of the world is driven by so many irrational instincts and impulses and all of that animal gunk within us that we would like to forget that we have that natural animalistic origin. And yet, Nietzsche, as one who knows, one who has uncovered this, is now aware of the fact that all of that is operating within him. That drives, these very old, primordial things within him are what is actually operant. And the consciousness is sort of it's a more recent development that's being used by all of that, right? So the inherent sort of irrationality at the base of the rational, that's the root of the conscious dream that we're having, and the understanding that one must go on dreaming. There is no getting out of that. You could wish that things were different, but they are not. That is the nature of human consciousness and human being, the human condition. That being said, I think it is very much worth comparing his words here to the language he uses in Birth of Tragedy. And Kaufman doesn't bring this up in his footnote in his commentary, which surprises me because he translated that book and maybe he just didn't think it was relevant. But in the early sections of that work, Nietzsche describes one of the ways of understanding art and doing art, which would be the Apollinian mode of art. And he says the Apollinian springs fundamentally from the human capacity for dream. In other words, one of the routes to mankind becoming an artistic animal, to discovering his artistic abilities, is through dreaming. Dreams are representations, images, recreations of sensation without having an immediate physical sensory experience, right? Like it's the mind's recreation of the images of the senses, or the feelings and sensations that come to the senses through an external stimulus, right? But in the dream, you're not actually having the external stimulus. It's an internal stimulus. It's the ability to represent what is not actually there, in other words, to meet those who are dead or imagine oneself in an impossible place or doing impossible things. And so accordingly, as Apollo is a god of dreams and also the god of the plastic arts, Nietzsche argues that through him, the Greeks come to a consciousness of aesthetics, one dimension of aesthetics, or one of the two twin art forces, the Apollinian. And I'm going to read here from a section of Birth of Tragedy. It's actually the very first section where Nietzsche elaborates on this idea. Quote, "Accordingly, the man susceptible to art stands in the same relation to the reality of dreams as the philosopher to the reality of existence. He is a close and willing observer, for from these pictures he reads the meaning of life, and by these processes he trains himself for life. And it is perhaps not only the agreeable and friendly pictures that he realizes in himself with such perfect understanding. The earnest, the troubled, the dreary, the gloomy, the sudden checks, the tricks of fortune, the uneasy presentiments, in short, the whole divine comedy of life and the inferno also pass before him, not merely like pictures on the wall, for he too lives and suffers in these scenes, and yet not without that fleeting sensation of appearance. And perhaps many a one will, like myself, recollect sometimes having called out cheerfully, and not without success, amid the dangers and terrors of dream life, 'It is a dream, I will dream on.'" End quote. Further down, Nietzsche continues, quote, "This cheerful acquiescence in the dream experience has likewise been embodied by the Greeks in their Apollo. For Apollo, as the god of all shaping energies, is also the soothsaying god. He who, as the etymology of the name indicates, is the Shining One, the deity of light, also rules over the fair appearance of the inner world of fantasies. End quote. So we have a clear connection to this passage here in the Gay Science, where Nietzsche says he has attained a consciousness that he is dreaming, and that he must go on dreaming lest he perish. The last time he employed that language in his writing, he was using the dream as a means of explaining to us how our representation of reality is an artistic act. That is the revelation of Apollo, so to speak, and of understanding the Apollonian style of art. And that comes straight out of Nietzsche's background in Schopenhauer and neo-Kantian thought in general. Again, the position that we don't experience an unmediated reality, but a reality that's mediated by our sense organs, and a reality that's represented, that is to say, constructed by our mental faculties. That the world of appearance that we experience is not a reality independent of the mind, but a reality that we only know through dependence on the mind. Because if we were to attempt to describe what this phenomenal reality, quote, really is, without reference to its appearances, we would very quickly find that we have nothing to say about it. Unless we want to be Platonists and suggest that the real reality is the intelligible laws and categories that we create within the mind. But Nietzsche goes the opposite direction and says, no, reality is appearance. And appearance is something that we know by recreating it, representing it to ourselves. And so this is the sense in which consciousness itself, the conscious subjective experience of reality, is itself like a dream. It is an artistic act because it is a representation, and there is no getting away from the dependence of our reality on our organs, our sense organs. And yet what does Nietzsche say here? That contra Kant and other such people, he's not willing to designate the appearance as therefore a mask for some unknown X. That the questions and the concern with what lies behind this artistic reality that we live in, this dream that we live in, can be described as that kind of quest to uncover its essence, what it is fundamentally, apart from us, apart from our minds, apart from our creative faculty for representation, what it really is apart from appearance. But Nietzsche says, what could that essence be aside from a description of the attributes of its appearance? So again, we live in the world of appearance, and we don't go beyond appearances just by wanting to really, really badly. In the same way, you're saddled with the body you're born into. You can't just select new character attributes, or you can't select new facial features like you're in the character selection screen of an RPG. So the entire philosophical quest that was launched by Socrates and Plato is a fool's errand. It's an attempt to say something about the essence, but what we have is not but the appearance. Schopenhauer did the same thing as well, and yet Nietzsche here is saying, I am confronting the reality. I am not looking for the world beyond appearances. From all accounts, the world is appearances. Appearance is what we're speaking about when we talk about the world. That's the meaning. The intelligible meaning is appearance. And Nietzsche uses this phrase, appearance is that which lives and is effective. And it's useful to consider the German term Wirklich, which means really or truly, and the word Wirklichkeit, reality. That first part of the word, Werk, we can hear the obvious cognate to the English word work. It means literally effective. So, in the colloquial sense in English, we would say, this works, it's effective, right? So reality is the place where things work, where force is effective, where change is effected. Reality is where the action happens. That's sort of the implication behind this term for reality. Reality is where there's effort and change and contest and creativity and so on and so forth. And where does all that take place? That takes place within the world of appearance. So, as Nietzsche says, appearance is what lives. And that, I think, ties in with his comments earlier that he's discovered for himself a whole human and animal past. That the truths we are uncovering here concern themselves with life and with the history of life, with physiology and with biology, with the empirical world. And, again, remember, the world we're describing, the world of appearances, that's the world in which science works, because science operates through and with the senses. So when we try to pursue knowledge independently of sensation, we depart from science, and instead we stop doing physics and start doing metaphysics. And so, what does Nietzsche say? That he's become aware of this dream, the dream that is the conscious representation of the world. But that, quote, I too who know am dancing my dance, end quote. So, this is my way of saying there's a grain of truth to Kaufmann's interpretation of the passage. It's a very common Nietzschean theme. We uncover the error, but then rather than raging against it, we pay tribute to the error. So in this case, the common error might be to regard the dream as not a dream, but as something like the unvarnished perception of a true reality. That's what people who believe in the correspondence theory of truth still hold. And the common person's perception of what they're doing and sensing and representing the world doesn't even usually reach the point of inquiring about the difference, or indeed the vast gulf between the assertion that one's senses detect something and the assertion that there's something independent of the mind, something that exists, quote unquote, beyond or out there. But Nietzsche doesn't say, well, look at these fools. He says, no, we're all dancing our dance as dreamers, and I too am doing the same. And the final insight here, the final remark that Nietzsche makes, is that the thinker is a means of prolonging this earthly dance. So another theme throughout Nietzsche's writing. The thinker, the philosopher, is himself another kind of artist, another kind of creative, who is related to the mystic or to the oracular priest or to the poet. We might recall some of the earliest claims in Book 1 of this very book, in the first aphorism, suggesting that the various teachers of a purpose of existence, those philosophers and saints who tried to uncover the causa finalis of all life, were in fact, even though they were mistaken, right, they themselves were one more encouragement to living, one more inducement to life, one more seduction to life. Even they are a tool of nature, being utilized for nature's purposes to get us to continue living and propagating ourselves, continuing this self-perpetuating dance of existence, this long dream. And one final thing Nietzsche says, actually, the interrelatedness of knowledge. So disciplines like the sciences or philosophy that attempt to constellate knowledge, that is actually the highest means to preserve the universality of dreaming. So science, philosophy, this doesn't lead us out of the dream. This preserves it. Our philosophical explanations of the dream are part of the dream. They're a way of coming to terms with life and saying, therefore, let me dream on. So the important thing here, philosophy, the sciences, religion, none of this ever escapes from the world of appearance, from the living world in which things work, live, and are effective. All of these human activities must be understood in reference to man as a living organism. That's Nietzsche's radical revolution in thought. That is so different from his point of view, from any previous philosophical perspective, that this awareness is akin to becoming aware, like a dreamer becoming aware that he's dreaming. But it's just worth noting, how many times, if you pick apart someone's argument, you'll find that it relies on trying to escape from the world of appearance. Usually I'm really thinking here of philosophical and religious arguments. That's a very, 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 very common theme. And if you truly embrace there is no escape from the world of appearances, this is a dream and I must dream on, it is quite a radical revolution. So we have a couple more aphorisms to go here with this book. We have number 55, the ultimate noble-mindedness. Quote, what makes a person noble? Certainly not making sacrifices, for those frantic with lust also make sacrifices. Certainly not following some passion, for there are contemptible passions. Certainly not doing something for others without selfishness. Perhaps nobody is more consistently selfish than those who are noble. Rather, the passion that attacks those who are noble is peculiar, and they fail to realize this. It involves the use of a rare and singular standard and almost a madness, the feeling of heat in things that feel cold to everybody else. The discovery of values for which no scales have been invented yet, offering sacrifices on altars that are dedicated to an unknown God, a courage without any desire for honors, a self-sufficiency that overflows and gives to men and things. Hitherto, it was a rarity and a lack of awareness of this rarity that made a person noble, but we should note that this standard involved an unfair judgment concerning everything usual, near, and indispensable. In short, that which most preserves the species and was the rule among men hitherto, all this was slandered on the whole in favor of the exceptions. To become the advocate of the rule, that might be the ultimate form and refinement in which noble-mindedness reveals itself on earth." End quote. So, what is noble? Remember, that's the title of the last book of Beyond Good and Evil, and much of that text is a sort of examination of the mindset of the old aristocracies. Why would Nietzsche be interested in such a thing? Why did he care? Why should we care? Well, to answer that, I think it's useful to consider another common question about the master morality, and that is Nietzsche discussing the noble as a kind of product of a caste, or is he describing instead a nobility of spirit, a nobility of the mind or of the character, or what? And the answer to that is both. The kind of spirit, the kind of worldview, the kind of mindset that he's describing exists necessarily as the outcome of a certain power relation in society. In other words, in the previous social arrangements at the beginnings of society, in which the relation between the top and the bottom of society was openly understood to be exploitative, and the nobility asserted that goodness and value and virtue came from within them. They felt themselves entitled to legislate morality, so to speak, to say for themselves what was good and what was bad as their own affirmative statement of values. In other words, not for any external purpose, not for any utilitarian purpose, and not as public servants or as adherents to a moral law. Rather, morality is simply a reflection of ourselves, right? What kind of person would feel like that? What kind of person would feel themselves to have that right? Well, someone who exists at the top of a hierarchy which is affirmed and even sanctified, and without ever trying to obscure that hierarchy, right? Much of Nietzsche's contrasting of the ancient world with ours involves that fact, that oftentimes we obscure hierarchy, we obscure power relations in order to moralize about it, in order to pretend that the society conforms to some moral law that we're supposed to believe in, even though it really doesn't. But in the ancient world, the noble knows he's noble. He affirms that fact. He says, "I deserve to be noble." And if we asked him by what standard, he might think that an unintelligible question, or just say it's obviously by his own standard. And if you think differently, maybe you could test him on that front, right? The claims of nobility were continually tested and thus reaffirmed by their having to exercise physical force to hold on to those claims of nobility. So what mindset does that produce? And we've gone over this a bit throughout the text so far, but Nietzsche gives multiple statements on what this nobility would have been like, some of which seem to contradict. So on the one hand, they're uniquely disciplined to control their passions. And on the other hand, Nietzsche says in an earlier aphorism, when they're at their best, their reason pauses. And those contradictions might confuse the new reader to Nietzsche. And I think a passage like this one will be their best help in untangling that confusion, insofar as it's really none of those particular attributes that make a person noble. You can describe the noble person as someone who follows a passion, but Nietzsche says people follow contemptible passions. So it isn't that they are passionate, nor is it that they master the passions, nor is it even some combination. What is it instead? It's a rare and singular standard and almost a madness. That's Nietzsche's language here. Meaning, they affirm their own singular judgments. They trust their own discernment. They have an almost mad faith in their own discernment. That's what it means to be noble. And this means that such a person's attention and their interests and what they value will seem strange to others. They'll have passion for things that make other men cold, right? But the starting point for understanding this is the self-affirmative character, which Nietzsche elaborates later in his philosophical canon. And that comes from a certain subjective experience which inclines one to live in a self-affirmative and utterly free manner, utterly independent manner. And so, accordingly, to have a kind of egotism, we might call it, that allows them to hold their own singular standard above the rule, right? What the rule might be for the common people. Now, what might confuse some new readers to Nietzsche further is that Nietzsche's final remark is that the ultimate noble-mindedness is to affirm the rule. But this will only be confusing to you if you're one of those people who constantly reads prescriptive statements into everything, reads oughts into everything. Granted, Nietzsche does use the language here of becoming an advocate, but I think we can understand this in the sense of speaking on behalf of. And Nietzsche, throughout this book, and arguably throughout his career, attempts to encapsulate the rule in that sense. He is an advocate for the rule in this way. So, for example, if you don't know what I mean by this, he does this with the will to power idea. He does this insofar as he diagnoses the problems of man, the psychological problems of man, by saying that they're rooted in physiology, right? So that is giving us a diagnosis, an understanding of what kind of being the human animal was and is and can be. So that is advocacy for, or speaking on behalf of, the rule. Just as with the will to power idea, Nietzsche similarly is speaking on behalf of the rule in the sense, by saying everything follows this rule, or all forces act according to this pattern or structure, if you don't want to conceive of it as a rule as such. And so this passage is one of these rare places where we see an explicit criticism of the old world aristocratic morality and perspective. He says they did an injustice to the rule, right? Their value standards were an unfair judgment concerning everything usual and near and indispensable. So through their narrow-mindedness and singularity of perspective, the noble classes proudly indulged the congenital defect of philosophers. And Nietzsche, even though he's an admirer of the noble mindset, and we can arguably say he attempts to conjure something of that mindset in the modern reader, or at least conjure maybe a similar admiration for it, he makes it his business to understand the rule and to speak on behalf of the rule, insofar as he speaks on the scale of universal existence. As a philosopher, he asserts an entire world picture, an entire understanding of existence, the patterns, the structures, the operations of life and nature, the relationships of command and obedience, and the relationships of tension, how inequalities in force are resolved, and so on and so forth. So ultimately, Nietzsche is again aiming at a new science, and the noble mindset's admirable in many ways, but it could even become higher, it could even attain its ultimate form if it allowed itself to become an advocate for the rule, to affirm the whole, we might say. And maybe an example of this in the moral sense, because I've kind of been speaking of being an advocate for the rule in sort of a purely descriptive sense, but we might consider Nietzsche himself, who is an advocate for the exception down to his very core. But the conclusion of Thus Spoke Zarathustra is the titular character, Zarathustra, accepting the fact that the higher man, the extraordinary man, the exception, will always perish or be botched or sacrificed or beaten down in some way. He'll always meet a tragic end. That pattern, the tragedy of life, that itself is the rule, right? And it's often what is common and what is unexceptional that affects this outcome upon the exceptional person. That the exception is destroyed is itself the rule. And so the exceptional thing about Zarathustra's perspective here is that even as he sees the supreme value in the exception, he concludes, well, the exception always perishes, so it must be a good thing for the great man to perish. It must be good to perish attempting the great and impossible, if that's the reality of life. And so that's how I would understand this passage here. So now we come to the final section of Book 1 of the Gay Science, after which we will conclude this first part of our walkthrough. And as I've mentioned before, this walkthrough will be broken up into parts, book by book. So next time we're going to return to the regular season episodes of the Nietzsche podcast. And that means beginning season 5. We'll return to the Gay Science, Book 2, in a couple of weeks. But for now, we're going to conclude by considering the final aphorism, entitled The Craving for Suffering. This is number 56, last one. Quote, "The craving for suffering. When I think of the craving to do something which continually tickles and spurs those millions of young Europeans who cannot endure their boredom and themselves, then I realize that they must have a craving to suffer, and to find in their suffering a probable reason for action, for deeds. Needliness is needed. Hence the politicians' clamor. Hence the many false, fictitious, exaggerated conditions of distress of all sorts of classes, and the blind readiness to believe in them. These young people demand that not happiness, but unhappiness should approach from the outside and become visible, and their imagination is busy in advance to turn it into a monster so that afterward they can fight a monster. If these people who crave distress felt the strength inside themselves to benefit themselves and to do something for themselves internally, then they would also know how to create for themselves internally their very own authentic distress. Then their inventions might be more refined and their satisfactions might sound like good music, while at present they fill the world with their clamor about distress and all too often introduce into it the feeling of distress. They do not know what to do with themselves and therefore paint the distress of others on the wall. They always need others and continually other others. Pardon me, my friends, I have ventured to paint my happiness on the wall. End quote. So a fine conclusion to Book 1. And underlying this, first of all, my first observation here, that underlying all this is the great difference between Nietzsche and the utilitarians insofar as they see an inherent value in pleasure, an inherent value in the relief of suffering, whereas Nietzsche sees an inherent value in suffering and a relatedness of pleasure to suffering. So that is why there could be a craving for suffering, because life is not actually oriented around seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. And oftentimes, the various organic life forms are quite capable of seeking out pain, of putting themselves into danger. And that's not just the case in the animal kingdom, but in the human condition. It's the case of many young people. In that earlier section, Nietzsche called them the explosive ones, the young people who have an immense amount of pent-up energy that needs to be given vent. But what is the nature of that energy? I mean, even the phrase energy, I think, is a bit too vague. And, well, metaphorically or poetically, you probably know what I mean. It doesn't really attribute a descriptive content to the nature of this force that wishes to discharge itself. What Nietzsche points out that's very interesting is that any cause wishes to externalize what is essentially this internalized drive to seek out suffering or challenge or struggle. That the impetus for struggle comes from within, comes from an inner ignition of force. To do what? To fight monsters. And so we make an icon then of that which is repugnant or evil, basically for the hidden purpose of simply fulfilling the inner need to have something worth fighting against. The monster is created for the purposes of fighting it, whatever image or form is given to it by a political party or a religion or a social movement. So we want the image of that which must be fought. And we want it, therefore, to approach from the outside. We want to encounter it as something that approaches us, aggresses against us. But Nietzsche says to really benefit ourselves, what we would seek out instead would be an inner struggle. That is to say, we wouldn't let some third party hijack our imagination. Our imagination, which is so eager to create a monster to fight, and then put that impulse to fight and struggle and experience pain or misery, which Nietzsche thinks is a positive, active impulse that we have. You know, the various seducers to a cause will always put that impulse into the form of some plebeianized image of, the enemy that we're all supposed to have, do the 2 minutes hate against, and so on and so forth. And Nietzsche argues if you wanted to have a truly authentic struggle, you could do it internally. So we would look to wage the inner jihad instead of the outer jihad, to put this into terms the Muslims will understand. But so the craving to fight and to struggle and to suffer is very real, and the distress that is spread throughout society today is a manifestation of that craving. There is a real antipathy, a real hatred between opposing political poles of society. There is a tension between the religious and the secular. There's a great divide in opinions even between the two genders now. And there's renewed outrage about social and cultural issues and renewed class hatred and antagonism. There's just a kind of stress that radiates throughout society, a kind of constant, if at times subtle, tension. And, one really gets the sense when you meditate on this for a long time or reflect on this for a long time, that what we want more than anything, what we really want deep down, is some enemy, some monstrous form of the enemy to appear so that we can settle the issue once and for all, because that would release the tension. And that monstrous form is always the caricature of the opponent and sometimes a a real person appears in the scene who so closely fits that caricature that they come to, they mantle the image, right? They come to embody those worst aspects, those monstrous aspects that are actually needed, found to be necessary by the opposing side. And so what is all of this? What is this culture of grievance? What does the zeitgeist feel like in the midst of a culture war? Why does it feel like when this immense craving for suffering, which hasn't been satisfied by modernity, it just yearns above all to leap out and confront an enemy? But what happens when it cannot? Well, it creates a culture in which all paint their feelings of distress on the wall. And more importantly, not even their own feelings, but those of others. We always need others. We constantly abnegate our own self-interest, especially in political and moral and religious causes, and we say, it's for the good of society that I speak. It's on behalf of all the suffering ones that I speak. Or it's because of my constituents, on the behalf of their rights that I speak. And in making this case, we display the suffering of others. And displaying the suffering of others is very motivating. It stirs people to action. No one likes to hear someone complain about their own suffering. But when somebody is informing you about the horrible suffering of other people, it's incredibly motivating. But when the tension is never released and the enemy is never really confronted, there's never a final settlement to any of this tension, right? What happens is it creates this constant culture of distress, this constant state of distress, that long dissatisfaction that Nietzsche mentioned in a previous aphorism. In a word, unhappiness, a constant fixation on the unhappiness that exists all around us, because it's one of the chief weapons in waging the war that we're all seeking. In the modern world, in order to wage war on the evil Republican, we say, look at the woman who's been hurt by having her reproductive rights infringed on. I mean, that is an argument one uses to engage in a fight, to dispossess their enemy of political power. It's a weapon. Or we say, look at how this small business owner's been harmed by the Democrats and their economic policy, their inflation, and so on. Again, to engage a political fight, one holds up the suffering, the unhappiness of others. And accordingly, after centuries of the democratic project, where are we now? We're all hyper-aware of the suffering of all sorts of groups and subgroups. And one of the sicknesses of the modern world is therefore to constantly dwell in these representations of unhappiness. And, Europe is eternally dissatisfied, as Nietzsche said. We have prolonged its dissatisfaction. We have prolonged discharging that energy, unleashing the tension of the bowstring, that the long illness of Europe has made it a genius of illness, as Nietzsche said in that earlier aphorism. And perhaps, therefore, there's a great opportunity here, something we can do with that energy that wants to be discharged. But because we never settle that urge, the representations of unhappiness have continued indefinitely. So what is the free spirit to do? The person aiming for that nobility of spirit, even as they happen to exist in a completely different social condition, the social condition of the modern world. What they're to do, Nietzsche says quite clearly, seek inner struggles. They might seek out philosophy for that reason. Perhaps their struggle might be to overcome themselves, overcome their own weaknesses, achieve success in some realm of human striving they once thought impossible, to become healthy, to become beautiful, to conquer their flaws to whatever degree is possible, or to find ways to use their flaws for the greater advantage of the whole self, right? And as if to provide in his own example a counter to the gloominess of the modern world with its continual dissatisfaction, Nietzsche, as one who has done this, who has sought out his struggle in the realm of health and sickness, and the discernment of truth from falsehood, and has struggled to overcome his own frailties, to affirm life in spite of the suffering that is a perennial part of his life, he offers us a counter-ideal. He says, here I am, a man who has chosen to paint his happiness on the wall, to represent this reality, this world of appearance, Wirklichkeit, as a grand comedy when regarded from that ultimate perspective. Something which needs no justification, no meaning, no conscious assent. A dance that we go on dancing, out of the sheer joy of it. That is Nietzsche's happiness as expressed in this book, the kind of joyous, devil-may-care attitude that constitutes the Gaia Scientia. Perhaps there has never been a more brutal introductory division of a book than Book 1 of the Gay Science, just in terms of objectively what Nietzsche says in his assessment of life and of the human condition. But nevertheless, there's probably never been a more brutal assessment that maintains such a cheerful tone throughout. That's really the claim I'd like to make. And so Nietzsche returns to that cheerfulness right here at the end of Book 1. And it is on that cheerful note that we shall therefore end this leg of the book club. So thank you once again for joining me, everyone. It's been a lot of fun. If you want to read ahead into books 2 or 3 of the Gay Science, go right ahead. It will probably help when we return to the book for the next parts of the walkthrough, since I think it behooves anyone who wants to understand Nietzsche to read and reread. Really, anyone who wants to understand any philosophy or any more difficult text. In the meantime, I'm very excited to jump right back into the podcast and actually, to be perfectly honest, to get away from Nietzsche for a bit. The episodes nowadays are really going to branch out, and we're starting this next season off with a return to ancient Greece. So please join me for the debut episode of Season 5 coming soon, a deep dive into the work of one of the greatest playwrights of the ages, Sophocles, who offered us a story whose characters and themes would influence novelists and philosophers and psychologists for ages to come. I'm sure many of you can figure out exactly what story I'm speaking of, but for those who haven't figured it out, you'll see soon enough. Thank you for joining me, everyone. Cheers. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.